What if the feral, starving orphan you dragged from the mud to serve in your halls was the very son you spent a decade mourning? King Cedric thought his bloodline died in ash, and betrayal completely blind to the fact that his greatest legacy was already stealing from his kitchen. The winter of 1482 was unforgiving in the kingdom of Ethelgard. The biting winds howling through the jagged peaks of the northern territories were harsh enough to freeze a man's blood in his veins, but they were nothing compared to the chilling reputation of Cedric Valerius. As the Alpha King of the Iron Moon Pack, Cedric had forged his reign in iron and blood. He was a ruthless tactician, a king who had subjugated 3 neighboring territories before his 30th birthday, and a man utterly devoid of mercy. His subjects whispered that his heart had been hollowed out 9 years ago, leaving behind a hollow vessel, fueled only by duty and vengeance. It was on the eve of the winter solstice that the impenetrable walls of Cedric's fortress were breached, not by an invading army, but by a shadow scurrying through the royal kitchens. Cedric had been returning from a grueling border patrol, his heavy dire wolf fur cloak dusted with snow, when the commotion erupted in the central courtyard. 2 fully grown, heavily armored guards were shouting, struggling to pin down a writhing, snarling mass of rags and mud in the center of the cobblestone square. A sack of stolen bread and dried meats lay spilled across the frost-covered ground. "Hold him down, damn it!" shouted Arthur Pendleton, the captain of the guard, clutching his forearm. Blood seeped through the thick leather of his gauntlet. The little rat bit right through the hide. Cedric strode forward, his heavy boots crunching against the ice. The sheer aura of his presence, the suffocating weight of a true alpha, sent the courtyard into immediate, terrifying silence. Even the hunting hounds, previously barking at the commotion, whined and pressed their bellies to the snow. "What is the meaning of this?" Cedric's voice was a low, gravelly baritone that demanded absolute obedience. The guards parted immediately, dropping to one knee. Left in the center of the circle was a boy. He could not have been older than 8 or 9. He was painfully thin, his ribs visible through the tears in his filthy linen tunic. He was coated in mud ash and frost, but it was not his wretched state that stopped the Alpha King dead in his tracks. It was the boy's defiance. Where any other human or wolf would have cowered under Cedric's gaze, the child stood up. He wiped the mud and a trickle of blood from his cheek with a trembling, frostbitten hand. Then he looked directly into the eyes of the most dangerous man in the realm. The boy's eyes were a startling, piercing shade of amber, the exact shade of molten gold. A violent jolt rushed through Cedric's chest. His inner wolf, usually a dormant, snarling beast that only awoke for slaughter, suddenly threw itself against the bars of his mind. It was not a roar of challenge. It was a frantic, desperate howl of recognition, a bone-deep protective instinct that nearly forced Cedric to his knees. His breath hitched. For a fleeting, agonizing second, the scent of rain and crushed pine filled his senses. The scent of Clara Godwin, the commoner woman he had loved and lost to the flames. 9 years ago. Cedric blinked violently, shoving the memory back into the dark recesses of his mind. "She is gone," he reminded himself harshly. "She burned in the Oakhaven raid. My father made sure of it." He was caught stealing from the royal larder. "Your Grace," Captain Pendleton said, interrupting Cedric's internal spiral. "He fights like a rabid dog. He's likely a rogue spawn from the borderlands. Shall I have him thrown in the dungeon or taken to the woods and disposed of?" The boy bared his teeth, a feral, cornered sound ripping from his small throat. He braced his feet in the snow, ready to fight men 10 times his size to the death. "Neither," Cedric heard himself say. The word felt foreign on his tongue. The guards exchanged bewildered glances. "Your Grace, release him," Cedric ordered, stepping closer to the child. The boy flinched but held his ground, his golden eyes locked on Cedric's. Up close, beneath the grime, there was a startling aristocratic sharpness to his jawline. "What is your name, boy?" The boy spat a mixture of blood and saliva at Cedric's boots. "None of your business, tyrant." Gasps echoed through the courtyard. Pendleton reached for his sword, ready to strike the child down for treason, but Cedric raised a single commanding hand, freezing the captain in place. Surprisingly, a ghost of a smirk played on the Alpha King's scarred lips. "You have spirit." "A rare commodity in these walls," Cedric murmured. He unclasped the heavy fur cloak from his shoulders, and in a move that shocked the entire courtyard, knelt in the snow, draping the immensely warm garment over the child's shivering shoulders. "If you have no name to give, I shall call you Finnick, and you are no longer a thief in my courtyard. You are my ward." "My lord, surely you jest." A sharp, aristocratic voice cut through the winter air. Stepping out from the archway was Lady Genevieve Belmont. She was a vision of winter royalty, clad in pristine white velvet and silver fox fur, her blonde hair woven with sapphires. She was Cedric's betrothed, a political match orchestrated to merge the Iron Moon with the wealthy Belmont bloodline. She looked at the mud-covered boy with unadulterated disgust. "You cannot be serious, Cedric," Genevieve sneered, lifting the hem of her gown to avoid the snow. "You intend to bring this filth into the castle. He is a street rat. He carries disease and rogue blood. I am the King, Genevieve," Cedric said coldly, standing up and dwarfing her with his massive frame. "I do not require your permission to claim a ward. He will be bathed, fed, and quartered in the East Wing, and if anyone in this castle lays a hand on him—" Cedric let his alpha aura flare a suffocating pressure that forced Genevieve to take a ragged breath and step back. "They will answer to my claws." Cedric looked back down at the boy who was now clutching the heavy fur cloak around himself, staring up at the giant king with a mixture of suspicion and awe. "Come, Finnick," Cedric commanded gently, and for the first time in his life, the feral orphan didn't run. He followed. 6 months passed. The brutal winter thawed into a muddy, vibrant spring, but the tension within the stone walls of Ethelgard only thickened. Finnick's integration into the castle was nothing short of chaotic. Despite being scrubbed clean, dressed in fine linen, and fed until his cheeks lost their hollowed look, the boy refused to act like a pampered royal ward. He hoarded bread under his mattress. He slept on the floor beside his bed rather than in it. He trusted no one speaking, only when spoken to, and even then his words were sharp and laced with venom. Yet, to the absolute bewilderment of the royal court, the ruthless Alpha King tolerated it all. Cedric, a man known to execute generals for minor failures, showed an endless quiet patience with the boy. He found himself rearranging his grueling political schedule just to watch Finnick in the training yards. On a crisp April morning, Cedric stood on the balcony overlooking the yard, his hands gripping the stone balustrade. Below, Finnick was sparring with a wooden practice sword against a squire 3 years his senior. The orphan moved with a terrifying, unrefined grace. He was relentless. When the older boy knocked Finnick into the dirt, Finnick didn't cry. He rolled, swept the squire's legs out from under him, and pinned him to the dust with the wooden blade at his throat. Cedric's heart hammered against his ribs. "He fights exactly like I do." Cedric realized a cold sweat breaking out on the back of his neck. The same low center of gravity. The same faint to the left. It wasn't just the fighting. It was the way Finnick scowled when he was thinking, the way he hated the taste of cooked carrots, refusing to eat them just as Cedric did. And then there were the eyes, those piercing, molten gold eyes. In the werewolf hierarchy, eye color was heavily dictated by bloodline. Amber eyes were a hallmark of the Valerius kings, but it was impossible. Cedric turned away from the balcony, retreating into the shadows of his study. He poured himself a goblet of spiced wine, his hands trembling slightly. 9 years ago he had been a prince, in love with Clara Godwin, a baker's daughter. They had loved each other fiercely in secret, away from the disapproving eyes of his tyrannical father, King Alaric. When Clara had whispered to Cedric that she was late with her moon cycle, Cedric had sworn to defy his father to reject any royal betrothal and mark her as his true Luna. He had left her in a cottage in Oakhaven to gather his loyal forces. He was gone for 2 days. By the time he returned, Oakhaven was a smouldering crater of ash and bone. King Alaric had ordered a purge, claiming a rogue pack was hiding there. Cedric had sifted through the still-burning embers with his bare hands, burning his flesh to the bone, but he found nothing except the melted silver locket he had given her. His father died 2 years later, poisoned, leaving Cedric the throne, a kingdom and a soul turned to ice. Clara was dead. His unborn child was dead. Finnick was just an orphan. The similarities were just a cruel trick of the gods designed to torture him. But Cedric was not the only one noticing the undeniable echoes of the past. In the West Wing, Lady Genevieve Belmont was seething. She paced across her opulent chambers, her silken gown trailing behind her like a serpent's tail. Sitting in the armchair by the fire was her father, Lord Harold Belmont, the wealthiest lord in the kingdom. "He refuses to set a date for the wedding, father." Genevieve spat her voice, trembling with rage. "He is entirely consumed by that feral street rat. He treats him more like an heir than a charity case." Lord Harold stroked his greying beard, his dark eyes narrowed in thought. "I have made inquiries, Genevieve. I paid the captain of the guard handsomely to investigate the boy's belongings when he first arrived." Harold pulled a small tarnished object from his velvet pouch and tossed it onto the table. It was a piece of melted silver crudely reshaped into a button. Genevieve leaned in, her brow furrowing. "What is this trash?" "It is not trash, my dear," Harold murmured. "It bears a faint engraving, a crescent moon wrapped in thorny vines, the crest of the Valerius house. But this specific casting, it is ancient, a piece of jewelry melted down." Genevieve's face drained of color. "The locket, the one Cedric gave to that commoner whore all those years ago. The one he claimed was lost in the fire." She looked up at her father, absolute horror dawning in her eyes. You think the boy—" "I think," Harold said coldly, "that if the boy is Cedric's bastard, your claim to the throne and any child you bear him will be challenged. The Alpha King is already overly attached. If he discovers the truth, if he realizes he has a living, breathing blood heir, our family will be cast aside. The boy is a threat, Genevieve, a threat that must be eliminated before the king's blind spot turns into a revelation." Genevieve's expression hardened from shock into a mask of pure, lethal ambition. "The great hunt is next week. The deep woods are treacherous. Accidents happen all the time to inexperienced boys who wander too far from the trail." The day of the great hunt dawned with a heavy, oppressive fog rolling through the weeping woods. It was a tradition meant to honor the pack's primal nature, a day when the royals and nobles hunted without their wolves, using only bows and spears to prove their human mastery over the wilderness. Finnick had insisted on coming. Cedric had reluctantly agreed, assigning 2 of his most trusted guards to shadow the boy at all times. But the deep woods were vast, and Genevieve's pockets were deep. By midday the hunting party had spread out. Cedric was tracking a massive elk near the northern ridge when a sudden sickening jolt ripped through his chest. It was the same violent pull he had felt in the courtyard 6 months ago, but this time it was laced with sheer, blinding terror. The bond, He didn't think. He didn't question it. Cedric dropped his spear, his body instinctively shifting mid-stride. Bones snapped and reformed muscles bulged, and within seconds, a monstrous midnight black dire wolf was tearing through the underbrush, roaring an alpha command that shook the leaves from the trees. Miles away in a steep rocky ravine, Finnick was backed against a jagged stone wall. His assigned guards were nowhere to be seen. Instead, pacing before the 9-year-old boy was a rogue wolf. It wasn't a natural beast. It was a shifter, stuck in a twisted, half-shifted form, froth dripping from its jaws. Genevieve had paid heavily to have a starved feral rogue smuggled into the hunting grounds and released near the boy. Finnick held a small hunting knife, his hands shaking violently. He was bleeding from a deep gash on his shoulder where the beast's claws had grazed him. The rogue lunged, jaws snapping for the boy's throat. Finnick screamed, but he didn't cower. In a surge of absolute desperate terror, something deep inside the orphan snapped. The human boy vanished, and a shockwave of raw, unbridled energy exploded from his small frame. Cedric burst through the tree line. At that exact second, his massive black wolf form airborne, ready to tear the rogue to shreds. But he crashed into the dirt, skidding to a halt, absolutely paralyzed by what he saw. Finnick hadn't just dodged. The boy was on all fours. His hands had elongated into deadly curved claws. The fur bursting from his forearms and framing his face wasn't the mottled brown of a commoner or a rogue. It was pitch black, tipped with shimmering metallic silver. The coat of a royal alpha. The rogue froze, terrified by the sudden surge of dominant aura radiating from the child. Before the beast could flee, Cedric closed the distance in a blur of shadow and fury, his massive jaws snapping the rogue's neck in a single brutal crunch. Cedric shifted back to his human form, ignoring his nakedness, ignoring the blood on his hands. He fell to his knees in the mud, staring at the panting, half-shifted boy. Finnick looked down at his own claws in absolute horror, tears streaming down his dirt-streaked face. Children were not supposed to be able to shift even partially until their 13th winter. Unless their bloodline was so incredibly potent, so ancient, that trauma forced the wolf to the surface to survive. Finnick. Cedric breathed his voice, cracking tears welling in the ruthless king's eyes for the first time in 9 years. He looked at the black and silver fur. He looked into the glowing, molten gold eyes. You're my son." The deep, guttural sound of Cedric's voice echoed off the damp stone of the ravine. He remained on his knees in the mud, his large, battle-scarred hands gently framing the boy's trembling face. As the immediate danger passed, the primal magic that had surged through Finnick's veins began to wane. The metallic silver-tipped black fur retracted into his skin, the deadly claws shrinking back into the bruised, dirt-stained fingers of a 9-year-old boy. Finnick collapsed forward, sobbing uncontrollably. The sheer physical toll of a premature shift was agonizing, but it was the terror of the unknown that broke him. "I'm a monster." The boy choked out his small hands, clutching the heavy fabric of Cedric's tunic. "The village boys. They said I was a demon. That's why she died. It's my fault." "No!" Cedric whispered fiercely, pulling the boy into a crushing embrace. He didn't care about the blood soaking into his skin or the rain beginning to fall through the forest canopy. "You are not a monster, Finnick. You are a wolf of the Valerius bloodline. You are a prince. My prince." Cedric carried the exhausted boy to a shallow, dry cave near the edge of the ravine, building a small fire to stave off the biting chill of the damp woods. As the flames danced, casting long, flickering shadows against the rock, Cedric finally dared to ask the question that was tearing his soul apart. "Your mother," Cedric began, his voice barely a rasp. "Tell me of your mother. Was her name Clara?" Finnick looked up, his molten gold eyes wide with shock. He reached into his tunic, pulling out the crude silver button, the melted remains of the locket. "How do you know that name?" She told me my father was a common soldier, a brave man who died fighting the northern raiders before I was born. Cedric closed his eyes, a solitary tear escaping and cutting a clean line through the soot on his cheek. "She lied to protect you. She knew that if my father, the old king, ever found out you existed, he would not stop until you were both in the ground." "How did she survive the fires of Oakhaven?" Sniffling, Finnick stared into the flames. She said a baker pushed her into a root cellar when the men with the red cloaks came with torches. She hid in the dark for 2 days. When she crawled out, everything was ash. A merchant woman named Mary Higgins found her on the road. My mother was burned. Her back and her arms were covered in terrible scars. Mary smuggled us across the border to a human settlement. Cedric's heart shattered all over again, imagining his beautiful Clara, terrified, scarred, and alone, bringing their child into the world in absolute poverty. "Why did you come here to Ethelgard? Why steal from my kitchens?" "She died last autumn." Finnick's voice broke. The smoke from the fires all those years ago ruined her lungs. A doctor, Dr. Thomas, tried to help, but we had no coin. On her deathbed, she gave me this piece of silver. She told me to go to the Iron Moon Pack. She said the king there would recognize it, that he was a good man who would give me a job in the stables. Clara had never intended for Finnick to claim the throne. She only wanted her son to be safe-fed and close to his father, even if Cedric never knew the truth. But as the grief washed over Cedric, it was quickly eclipsed by a towering, monstrous rage. Finnick had mentioned men with red cloaks. The old king's royal guard wore black and silver. The only house in the kingdom that wore crimson cloaks into battle was House Belmont. Harold Belmont had been the commander of the vanguard 9 years ago. He was the one who personally executed the purge of Oakhaven. Cedric stood up, his massive frame blocking out the light of the fire. The pieces of the puzzle aggressively snapped together. The missing guards, the feral rogue released in a secured hunting ground, Genevieve's sudden, intense hatred for a random orphan. They knew. Harold had seen the melted silver, recognized his own failure to finish the job 9 years ago, and sought to murder Cedric's only son to secure his daughter's crown. "Can you walk, my son?" Cedric asked, his voice entirely devoid of warmth, replaced by the chilling, lethal calm of the Alpha King. Finnick nodded, scrambling to his feet, his golden eyes reflecting the deadly fire in his father's gaze. "Good! Stay close to me," Cedric commanded, drawing a hunting blade from his boot. "We have a kingdom to clean." The great hall of Ethelgard was a masterpiece of medieval architecture, its vaulted ceilings supported by massive pillars of dark oak. Tonight, however, it felt like a tomb. Lord Harold Belmont and Lady Genevieve stood near the roaring fireplace, their faces arranged in masks of perfect somber tragedy. Word had reached the castle an hour prior that the king was returning on foot, carrying a bloodied bundle wrapped in his heavy direwolf cloak. The court had assembled in a hushed, anxious silence. Captain Arthur Pendleton stood at attention by the massive iron doors, his face grim. When the heavy doors groaned open, the temperature in the hall seemed to plummet. Cedric Valerius strode in. He was covered in mud and dried blood, his eyes burning with a terrifying, unnatural luminescence. In his arms he carried his heavy fur cloak, bundled as if holding a small, lifeless body. Genevieve rushed forward, producing a lace handkerchief to dab at her perfectly dry eyes. "My king, we heard the horrific news. The deep woods are so perilous. I warned you that the feral boy was too inexperienced to survive such a venture. What a terrible tragic accident." Lord Harold bowed his head, though a smug, satisfied glint danced in his dark eyes. "A tragedy indeed, Your Grace. But you must not blame yourself. Rogue wolves are unpredictable beasts. We shall mourn the boy, and then we must look to the future, to securing your legacy." Cedric stopped in the center of the hall. He did not look at Genevieve. His deadly gaze was fixed entirely on Harold. "You are right, Harold." Cedric's voice boomed, rattling the shields hanging on the stone walls. "We must look to my legacy. But you are wrong about one thing. It was no accident." Harold's smile faltered. "My lord," Cedric gently lowered the bloodied cloak to the stone floor. But instead of unrolling it, he stepped aside. From the shadows of the arched entryway, a small figure stepped into the torchlight. Gasps erupted throughout the great hall. Ladies covered their mouths in shock. Lords took involuntary steps backward. Finnick stood there alive and entirely unharmed, scrubbed clean of the forest mud. But he was no longer dressed in the simple linen of a ward. He was draped in a tailored tunic of midnight velvet, and pinned to his chest was the heavy, unmistakable silver crest of the Crown Prince of the Iron Moon. Genevieve shrieked, stumbling backward as if she had seen a ghost. "What is this? He is a street rat, a thief. He is Finnick Valerius!" Cedric roared, his alpha aura exploding outward with such concussive force that several lesser lords were driven to their knees. "He is my blood, my heir, and the rightful crown prince of this pack." Harold Belmont's face drained of all color. He instinctively reached for the hilt of his sword, but before his fingers could even brush the pommel, Captain Pendleton and 6 heavily armed royal guards stepped forward, their spears leveled directly at the Belmont lord's throat. "Did you really think I wouldn't recognize the scent of your rotting ambition?" Harold Cedric took a slow, predatory step forward. "Did you think I wouldn't drag the truth from the shadows you burned Oakhaven 9 years ago? You murdered my mate Clara and thought you burned my unborn child with her. And today you paid smugglers to release a rogue wolf to finish what you started." "Lies," Harold spat, though his knees trembled. "You have no proof you cannot execute a high lord on the word of a bastard orphan." Cedric didn't bother arguing. In a blur of motion, too fast for the human eye to follow, the Alpha King closed the distance. He didn't use a sword. He didn't shift. He simply clamped his massive iron grip hand around Harold Belmont's throat and lifted the grown man entirely off the ground. "I am the king," Cedric whispered his voice, a lethal promise that carried through the dead, silent hall. "I am the proof." With a sickening, definitive snap, Cedric broke Lord Belmont's neck. He tossed the lifeless body to the cold stone floor with absolute disgust. Genevieve screamed, falling to her knees beside her father's corpse, weeping hysterically. "Captain Pendleton," Cedric ordered, not even sparing the sobbing woman a glance. "Strip Lady Genevieve of all royal titles and confiscate the Belmont lands. Throw her out of the castle gates. If she is found within the borders of Ethelgard by sunrise, she will be hunted as a rogue. At once, Your Grace," Pendleton said, signaling the guards to drag the screaming, thrashing woman away. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the scent of blood and the absolute, undisputed authority of the Alpha King. Cedric took a deep breath, letting the rage bleed out of his muscles. He turned around, his expression softening instantly as he looked at the small boy standing bravely by the door. Cedric walked over and knelt before Finnick, bringing himself down to eye level. For the first time in nearly a decade, the King of the Iron Moon offered a genuine, unburdened smile. "The shadows are gone, Finnick," Cedric said softly, placing a warm hand on his son's shoulder. "You are home." Finnick looked at the massive, terrifying king, then at the silver crest on his own chest. The feral orphan, the runaway who had known nothing but hunger and fear, finally let his guard down. He threw his arms around Cedric's neck, burying his face in his father's shoulder. Thank you, Father, Finnick whispered. The reign of the ruthless Hollow King was over. In his place stood a father, fiercely protective, undeniably powerful, and finally whole. If this heart-wrenching tale of betrayal, lost love, and a father's fierce protection kept you on the edge of your seat, don't keep it to yourself. Smash that like button to support the channel. Share this incredible drama with your friends, and make sure to subscribe so you never miss another thrilling werewolf romance story. Drop a comment below with your favorite plot twist.